Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life and times of Alfred Russel Wallace, who lived through much of the 19th century and is considered to be the co-developer of the theory of evolution, an idea he independently came up with and then would share with Charles Darwin, who was working on his own theory at the time. Alfred Russel Wallace was also a political radical and an avowed socialist who campaigned for the nationalization of land and for the right for women to vote. My guest for this conversation is James T. Costais. James Costais is professor of biology and executive director of the Highlands Biological Station at Western Carolina University. And he is the author of the book that he joins us to talk about. It's called Radical by Nature, The Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace. James Costais, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks so much. Great pleasure to be here.
Let me just dive right into the issue and the theory of evolution and his relationship to Charles Darwin. Right at the top here. We'll jump around afterwards in the timeline and get more of a biographical sketch of Alfred.
Sure.
But why is it that it's Darwin's name that we associate with evolution and not Alfred Russel Wallace? Now, obviously, you associate his name with evolution, and you're not alone. There's others who do, but most people do not. Why is that?
True. Yeah, very, very true. You know, Darwin's name is a household name, and Darwin is often assumed to be, the originator of this idea, this insight, evolution by natural selection. And why is that? And why do we, not know so much about Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer, the principle of natural selection? Well, probably in a nutshell, I think there are several reasons, but in a nutshell, it probably starts with Wallace himself. Actually, Wallace himself really tended to defer to Darwin's seniority in this matter. When he came to realize that Darwin had come to these ideas some years before he did, but then very importantly, Darwin had been working on a book that was to have been called Natural Selection, and an abridged version of that book was ultimately published as On the Origin of Species, and that was the first real, big, comprehensive public announcement of the theory. And even there, of course, it's a monumental book, and Wallace recognized that, and again, sort of took his hat off to Darwin. And so I think it's fair to say that between the two of them, Darwin rightly feeling like this was essentially, his idea that he had been, working on in secret, right, for some years, taking only a very few people into his confidence. But then Wallace himself recognizing that achievement and, always tending to defer, to Darwin, even eventually in later years when he published his own kind of in a way, an updated version as he saw it of some of the ideas on the origin of species. Wallace entitled that work Darwinism, and I think that there are other related reasons that are interesting to consider that have to do with maybe the idea that the Darwin name was actually already a famous name. Darwin in his own right, quite an accomplished individual, was already very well known as a well-respected naturalist through the publication of his travel narrative, The Voyage of the Beagle, but also coming from an illustrious family. And his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, in his day, in the late 18th century, was quite a famous poet and physician. This name was already well known and well regarded. And so it's maybe, partly understandable then how the name would just kind of continue to sort of, that star continued to rise and the name continued to get brighter and brighter after natural selection was announced.
So before the ideas of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace would come together, and you'll correct me if that's not the correct way to view it, were their ideas of evolution different? Did they come to this idea of natural selection in a different way?
Yes, the idea was not new. It was not original with Darwin or Wallace, and it's sometimes assumed, I guess, because Darwin, and the idea of evolution by natural selection looms large, that this idea was hit upon by these guys, and was something new. But the idea of evolution is really, in some ways, maybe even an ancient idea, but certainly in terms of scientific thought, at least, since the 18th century, there have been various hypotheses that have been kicked around, basically people trying to connect dots, looking at patterns in nature, making sense of, for example, fossils, as fossils were becoming recognized as the remains of once living organisms. How do we make sense of that? And we're beginning to better understand the antiquity of the Earth and changes that have occurred in the Earth. And so a kind of evolutionary model was kicked around by some, but those patterns could also be understood in a theological framework. And that was really the more conventional way to look at these things. The idea of maybe successive rounds of special creation and extinction, sort of very teleological, progressive way of looking at changes in Earth history. And for those that are thinking in terms of this being divinely guided and maybe preparing for humans, right, on Earth, the idea would be that a creator would set the stage at different epochs of Earth history, eventually kind of creating the conditions that we now know as, a kind of, human-centric presence on Earth. So that would be one way to make sense of the puzzles over ancient life, seemingly so different from modern organisms. But there's also an evolutionary way to look at that. But it's fair to say that those evolutionary ideas were considered to be, well, they were pretty fringe. They were considered to be, in some cases, just downright disreputable, simply because they could be taken as contradicting the theological view of things, and therefore kind of questioning the veracity of Scripture and the veracity of theological thought at a time when these were, centrally important social institutions.
So here's Charles Darwin, as you mentioned, working on his theory of evolution, almost in secret. And then what? He gets a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace with Wallace's ideas of evolution. And at first it's pretty devastating, isn't it? Because he thinks he's on, and he is on, to something really big here.
Yeah, absolutely. This wasn't, in a way, it shouldn't have been a complete bombshell for Darwin, because actually, Wallace's writings from the field did catch the attention of prominent naturalists back in London. For example, Darwin's friend, the great geologist Charles Lyell, and others who had noticed, for example, this really interesting paper that Wallace had written in Sarawak, Borneo, and was published in 1855. We sort of call it the Sarawak Law paper these days. And it can be seen as a kind of, again, to use that same expression, connecting dots, making sense of seemingly unconnected observations, in that case, both paleontologically, but also in terms of the relationships of species as they are distributed on Earth. And Wallace seemingly had quite a knack for seeing these patterns, connecting these dots, wrote this really interesting paper that Darwin's friends like Lyell noticed and actually drew Darwin's attention to, and essentially said, wow, this is very interesting stuff. You should, they could certainly tell that there's, you could see this as having an evolutionary context. But Darwin really didn't think that Wallace had the most important ingredient that he had, and that was natural selection. So remember, as we were just talking about a moment ago, the idea of evolution had been around for quite a while. The idea perhaps that species could change, but there was never any plausible mechanism. So not only was it kind of a fringe and disreputable idea, but it just seemed nonsensical from a scientific point of view. Just how could this even possibly happen? And so Darwin, I think, believed that he had the answer, and it's so deceptively simple, this idea of natural selection. And so very different from anything that anyone had ever thought about in connection with species change. So counterintuitive. I think, you could kind of understand why he thought, this guy has nothing on me, right? He may talk about kind of seeming evolution, or as they would have called it, transmutation,
Yeah.
of species over time, but he doesn't have the mechanism, but Wallace was really thinking deeply about this subject, and it took him a while, right? But he, by his own account, he suddenly hit upon this notion, this idea, in early 1858, and indeed, it was strikingly similar to Darwin's own insights. And as fate would have it, the two had already been corresponding with each other, and they sort of hinted to each other about their interests in the nature of species and varieties, and
but not giving it up.
So
but not giving it up.
But not giving it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then who should Wallace send his, new idea to, but Darwin. And I've speculated too that, and I think there's good evidence for this, that really Darwin was a means to an end for Wallace, the end being the dean of British science at that time would have been Charles Lyell, the great geologist. And Lyell, in his famous Principles of Geology, he laid out reasons why transmutation, species change, could not happen. And really that was widely accepted as just the final word on the matter. And we now know, just by studying Wallace's own field notebooks from the time, that he's planning his own arguments to counter Lyell and writing out passages from Lyell in his notebook, rebutting them. So it's not a coincidence that when Wallace did send his new theory to Darwin, in the cover letter, he asked Darwin if he thought it was worthwhile, please show it to Lyell, right? He was really trying to reach, the upper echelons of British science, because if you can convince the likes of Lyell about this idea, then you'd really be getting somewhere,
What was Charles Darwin's reaction when he first got it? They would become friends, Charles Darwin and Alfred. Well, they already were friends, but they would remain friends, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. But what was Darwin's reaction at first when he first got that letter?
Well, yeah. I mean, he was devastated, right? He's just, completely broadsided by this, and really just, did not think that anyone would have come up with this notion. Now, it turns out, with the benefit of hindsight, there are various other writers in the 19th century that have hit upon similar ideas. Like one Patrick Matthew, for example, never really widely shared them or developed them, but maybe the idea is not so unusual as Darwin thought it was. But it's fair to say he was absolutely devastated, and he was staggered. And he struggled over what's the honorable thing to do. He as requested in the cover letter, he forwarded this essay to Charles Lyell, and he lamented that all of his work was now lost. All was lost, and it was a very hard time for Darwin in more ways than one, because just at that very moment, actually, disease was kind of sweeping through the village, and his own child became deathly ill. And so, this was just compounding just the angst that he was feeling at that time. He also thought that Wallace's idea was almost, exactly, letter for letter, chapter and verse, exactly his theory. There are actually some interesting differences here and there. You can tell that they were independently formulated takes on this idea of natural selection. Wallace never coined a name for the mechanism. Darwin had long since come up with natural selection. Wallace never especially liked that name, but still, in terms of the way this thing worked, in terms of heritable, abundant variation, differential, survival, reproduction, giving rise to a kind of selection dynamic, That is common to the two versions of the theory.
It sounds like Alfred Russel Wallace had, I guess we call it a magnanimous nature about himself, in seeing Charles Darwin and promoting Charles Darwin and the theory, calling it Darwinism himself. Is that do you think that's accurate, and would that sort of characterize other aspects of his life?
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, Wallace is just astoundingly a genuinely generous person. I mean, is magnanimous. Um, he deferred to Darwin on this, rightly recognizing in The Origin of Species Darwin's accomplishment. Um, if one was to expect, sour grapes or reservations, from someone like Wallace, because it's been speculated, well, of course he's going to be, generous about it. What choice did he have? He's not in the same league as the senior naturalist. He wants the benefit of being welcomed into their circle, and it's a class thing, But I really disagree with that. Wallace never shied away from issuing a challenge in a respectful way, right? When he thought he was in the right, he never shied away from approaching the great and the good about with his ideas. Even in his early 20s, right? He had this trait. In letters to friends and family, where you might expect him to be airing grievances about, the idea of natural selection, had been revealed. His essay read without his knowledge. At the Linnaean Society, Darwin's unpublished writings have been put forth first. And some have since said that's unfair. Wallace did not see it that way, and in these letters to friends and family, he had nothing but the highest of praise, for Darwin's accomplishment. And I don't buy that it was simply a class thing, that he's going to kind of back down and cower because Darwin is sort of an exalted figure. That's not his personality. He's quite genuine in this. Now, having said that, I mean, I should also say, I think maybe to a fault, he's maybe generous to a fault, because he really is such a remarkable and insightful thinker that he just does himself a disservice, by constantly deferring to Darwin and choosing to take the back seat and not putting his name out there, not pushing, the idea of his independent discovery of the principle of natural selection. Very late in life, he did a bit more, but not in a very overt, pushy way. I mean, again, he's always just the picture of generosity when it comes to these things, and that's maybe one of the motivations for writing my book, is to help people maybe not only better understand Wallace as a naturalist, which itself, his accomplishments there are quite remarkable, but also to better understand Wallace the person and what makes him tick, and maybe to do for him what he wasn't willing to do for himself, help his light shine a bit more brightly. In my opinion, it's all the brighter because you have not only these prodigious scientific accomplishments, but then these really remarkable social interests that he pursues really throughout his long life.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about the life and times of Alfred Russel Wallace. Our guest is James T. Costa. James Costa is professor of biology and executive director of the Highlands Biological Station at Western Carolina University. He is the author of a number of books along this line of what we're talking about today. His latest is called The Revolutionary Life of Alfred. His latest is called, let me say it again, Radical by Nature, The Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace. Let's talk about class. Let's talk about where he comes from, and let's talk about his social issues. Alfred Russel Wallace was born on January 8th, 1823 in southern Wales. He was not wealthy.
He was not wealthy. His family was not wealthy. They were sort of squarely kind of middle class, genteel family, but one that had come on hard times. his father trained as a lawyer, but never practiced as a lawyer. He had literary tastes and interests. He had attempted a couple of ventures, like a little literary magazine and things like that. But these failed. Wallace's father seemed to really not be able to hang on to money very long. The family, it's fair to say, they just kind of, were hemorrhaging money. And so the family had moved before Alfred was born and his youngest brother was born to South Wales. And as he described it, a motivation for that was because the living was as cheap as possible. We had a growing family. I mean, Wallace is the eighth of nine. And we're struggling, and yet for all that, quite an interesting family. I mean, the father, and again, you get a sense through the literary tastes, worked at a time as a town librarian, bringing books home. You have a sense of a family life that's really full of ideas and reading and recitation of poetry and those sorts of things. But so it's sometimes Wallace is mistakenly thought of as a sort of lower class or working class. He was a working man as a young man, for sure, right? But the family could be better described as middle class, in terms of their, the kind of family background and their education and such, but had fallen on hard times. And one manifestation of the hard times was the necessity of Alfred having to leave school at the age of maybe 13, 14, so his only formal schooling at the grammar school level ended at that point.
And that's interesting in of itself. Let me ask you about, this is a time of what was known as the enclosure laws. And what that meant was basically privatizing what was known as the commons, land, parts of the forest that were available for everyone to be able to use. But these enclosure laws would enclose those, and people would start, and they would be owned instead. Maybe say, is there anything more to understand about the enclosure laws? But tell me the importance of these laws to the life of and the views of Alfred Russel Wallace.
Sure, yeah. The enclosure laws and enclosure itself, that had some interesting effects on Wallace in more ways than one. So what had been common lands, where your cows, people could commonly graze their cows, they could gather food and such freely. They could till the land in common. They would often pay rent, tithes to the church. Oftentimes these were de facto owned by either aristocrats or the church. And rent would be typically paid in the form of in tithes, and so you might pay in meat and eggs and firewood and those sorts of things. So we had a combination of things happening, big changes happening in Britain at that time, with enclosure. Concomitantly, there is the idea of the commutation of tithes, the conversion of tithes from an in-kind payment to cash payments. And for really, seriously impoverished people who are really living, off the land, very closely to the land, this creates something of a hardship, as you can imagine. There is a great and booming surveying business, because in order to quantify just how much would be owed, you have to know the precise acreage involved. And so what was just open land becomes enclosed by literally becoming surveyed and then fences erected. And so people could no longer use the land in common. And so, many people viewed this as, really dispossessing people of their ancient right to these lands, and then also creating the double hardship of forcing a kind of payment in cash rather than in kind. So where someone might have been able to pay off their debt by laboring in the fields and providing produce. Now, no, they need to get cash. They need to get money. And in addition to the enclosure movement, there is the rise of the railroads, of the canals. There's plenty of surveying business. So on the one hand, for the young Alfred Russel Wallace and his family, these movements, they actually result in a lot of business and therefore a lot of training for Alfred Russel Wallace, who begins to work as a kind of apprentice surveyor at one point for his eldest brother, William, who is a surveyor. He has a surveying business based in the Welsh town of Neath, and it's rather successful, right? There's a lot of work.
He's helping to draw these lines of enclosure.
Yes, he's literally, he's helping draw these lines, because it's not just doing the surveying work, but it's the related work of map making. So, they would get commissions. They would be hired by a parish here, an estate there, to survey and then draw a map. And these maps are used to then quantify acreage of land, and that would be used to determine what kind of taxes are going to be paid on these lands. So on the one hand, some really valuable training and also exposure to nature for the young Wallace. But then on the other hand, he doesn't quite realize it at the time, but a little later in life, he comes to realize the injustice, right? That what is going on, that these poor Welsh farmers are being dispossessed of their land. This is creating an extreme hardship on these people. And later on, it does feed into his very strong kind of socialistic streak. For many years, he's something of what we would call an Owenite socialist, right?
Robert Owen.
A follower of Robert Owen, the great Welsh reformer. He becomes really taken with the idea of land nationalization. And it's not a coincidence. This movement this is a strongly held belief on Wallace's part. It relates directly back to his efforts as a young surveyor in providing those maps, right, that are dispossessing people of their ancient right to the land.
I've heard Robert Owen described as one of the earliest socialists we would have.
Yes, I think that's, and I'm not truly expert on the history of socialism, but I think, in the 18th and into the 19th century is an interesting time where in Britain and elsewhere where people are debating, the merits of different social and political systems, the best way for people to live, with the most just, the most maybe beneficent, utilitarian ideas, the greatest good for the greatest number. Owen was certainly very much of that streak, like Jeremy Bentham, right? These ideas of how to improve the human condition. And they were, they had big ideas. And Owen had big, grandiose ideas about social experiments on a grand scale. He had devised and founded social experimental communities like New Lanark in Scotland. And here in the US, there are quite a few experimental Owenite communities. Maybe the biggest and most famous would be New Harmony, Indiana, as one example. So Wallace, as a young guy, when he is still, he didn't go off yet, to become an apprentice surveyor. He's living in London with his brother John. He had two older brothers, so John and then William, the eldest. And John is an apprentice to a builder. And while they're living in London, they're frequenting the mechanics institutes. They're frequenting the so-called halls of science, where these kind of radical ideas, like Owen's ideas, would be aired. The free speeches, lots and lots of ideas, a real ferment of ideas. You can imagine how exciting that would be, for like, a kid in his teens, really, keenly interested in these questions. And he recounted in his autobiography much later, Wallace did, that he once had an opportunity to hear Owen speak in one of these halls of science. And so, I do think that these ideas really struck a chord with Wallace from pretty early on, but it took him a while, I think, for them to that inward ferment to really come to fruition, for him to begin to really understand the magnitude of that injustice as he saw it and what could be done about it, and then lending, putting his energy and his and the authority of his name into these movements, hoping to right these wrongs, like, for example, the Land Nationalization Society as one of his great causes for many years.
He also supported the right for women to vote, but his support for women went much deeper than just voting as well, didn't it?
Yeah, see, Wallace was in many ways, so it's interesting to think about. I don't see Wallace as in regard to these social interests having come up with altogether novel and ideas and then trying to push them. He sees what's happening and it resonates with him. And the arguments about women's suffrage and women's legal and economic autonomy, their full rights as citizens, he begins to realize this is a grave injustice, that they are denied these rights. It's not just the vote, right? It is, they don't have the right to inherit land, or property or wealth. They don't have the right to, hold certain occupations. And this strikes him as just deeply wrong. And so, as part of his growing interest, especially when you begin to get into the 1880s in socialism, and he actually declares himself an avowed socialist at this point. He becomes very excited by the writings of Edward Bellamy, who wrote then at that time a best-selling book, kind of a social utopia called Looking Backward, and an interesting portrait of society a century hence. And in it, Bellamy had talked about women's free choice of marriage as really being a kind of natural sexual selection process, a la Darwin, a process that in the natural world, ironically, Wallace had come to reject, but now kind of saw Bellamy's idea of applying this to humans, and it really resonated and dovetailed nicely with this idea of women's autonomy. Legally speaking, they should have full rights. They should have the vote, and this is therefore a form of free choice in marriage that, left to their own devices and making wise choices and not having to make marriage choices based on economic necessity, needing somebody to, take care of them, that this would actually result in, this is, by the way, rather naive perhaps, right? But it would result in societal improvement because they would be choosing only the finest and most upstanding, of prospective husbands, and that this would tend to improve society over time. It seems quite naive today, for a number of reasons. But I find it striking how earnest Wallace is in believing this, and how it kind of goes right to the core of his yearning, really, for societal improvement. And he sees, full equality of women as absolutely an essential part of that.
Do you see a connection or parallel between for Wallace, between his scientific work, his scientific understanding, and his politics? And maybe also throw in, he was fiercely anti-eugenics, anti-social Darwinism, as was Darwin himself. But this was, we also get sort of the rise of scientific racism in this period.
Yeah, very, very true. Well, it's interesting you ask that, considering that the idea of evolution was itself, right, a rather radical idea, right, especially in 18th and into the early 19th century, and still considered to be, maybe scandalous by some, even after On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. For Wallace, as a young guy, to so quickly embrace the idea of species change and have the audacity as a young guy without the benefit of a whole lot of, formal education and finances and, institutional connections, social status, to have the audacity to think that he could explore and maybe help address these grand questions. That says something about Wallace's personality, right? The kind of radical, revolutionary, iconoclastic, pushing personality. So although later maybe you could see the idea of evolution by natural selection, the idea of species change becoming very much accepted by the late 19th century in scientific circles, we see Wallace equally embracing these other fringe ideas. And so just as transmutation would have been a fringe radical notion earlier on, sure, that became more acceptable, but his other interests were similarly embraced with that same, that same iconoclastic frame of mind. Those would include socialism, absolutely. And those would include, controversial ideas like giving women the vote, for example, or spiritualism for that matter, right? The idea that, well, there could be this kind of parallel spirit realm out there. We just don't know. We haven't explored this scientifically. How do we know? And this would be typical Wallace, kind of pushing that envelope while he's also pushing buttons, right? He's pushing the buttons of his scientific colleagues, trying to get them to take these fringe notions seriously.
Tell me more about spiritualism. What does that mean?
Sure. Yeah. Well, spiritualism in the 19th century is a movement that shouldn't be confused with what we would call today spirituality, which is typically spirituality we think of in connection with deep religious thought of some kind, religious feeling of some kind. Spiritualism was an idea that didn't necessarily have anything to do with any religion, but it was a belief in the idea that there may be a kind of continued existence of the human soul, for want of a better word, that might continue to exist. One analogy that often comes to mind is that of a kind of parallel universe. We see a certain reality in the here and now, but there could be another reality, an aspect to nature that we just are not cognizant of. And at the time, especially in the 19th century, there was this idea that, therefore, death is never really, 100%, right? The physical death in this life may occur, but this soul, or whatever you want to call the spirit being, may live on. And that's maybe the one area where you could see some commonality with conventional religious thought, right? The idea of immortality of the soul, let's say. But the spiritualists believed seemingly that there was a kind of parallel realm of existence, and that it was possible at times, or maybe with certain special talents, to communicate with those spirits, and maybe even in some way they hold lessons for us. Maybe in their way they're actually helping to guide us in some way, and maybe they are eventually sort of the better angels of our nature that we here on earth, in a sense, are kind of moving towards. And it gets rather metaphysical, very squishy, very quickly. But Wallace is rather earnest about that, and you can see how that thinking would begin to take on more and more of a kind of theistic overtone. And I think it's fair to say in Wallace's latest writings and thinking, he gets more overtly theological almost, even though, as he himself would say, right, he would not consider himself to be, a Christian. He would not consider himself to be any kind of a conventional religious thinker of any kind, really. And yet, these ideas, they certainly take on the overtones of a kind of theism, which is one reason why today I think those ideas of Wallace's resonate with some people today, for example, who advocate for intelligent design. The idea that yes, evolution may occurs, certainly, but maybe it's somehow guided along by some other intelligence or force. And it's true that Wallace did kind of come to that idea, in a way. It should be pointed out that, although maybe disreputable in the eyes of the scientific community of Wallace's day, that's not to say that more than a few fellow scientists didn't get into it. And in fact, in society in general, it was all the rage. Famous figures, like Arthur Conan Doyle and others that took this very seriously. There was every reason to think that, sure, we don't have the fullest picture of reality. Why couldn't there be, this other realm? And Wallace tried to make what we should recognize as perfectly logical arguments and analogies of why this should be taken seriously, even though his fellow naturalists refused to go down that path with him. And I'll give you one very quick example, and that is where Wallace used the analogy of the invention of the microscope, pointing out that, some centuries ago, the idea of small organisms swimming around in a mere drop of pond water would have been taken as just ludicrous and maybe blasphemous, but with the right technology, i.e. the microscope, indeed we can now see, these microorganisms. And so he made this analogy saying maybe there is this spirit realm. We just need the right tools. We need the right technology to be able to detect this realm.
That's interesting. This would strain, not end, but strain his relationship to Charles Darwin.
Yes, well, it was one of several, Wallace's many interests, outside of science, let's say, would often induce, just to sort of put this in more modern terms, right? Just eye rolling, right? Right. His friends, including Darwin enormously admired Wallace's talents, and he is recognized by Darwin and his circle as just a naturalist of the first rank. And they really longed for him to focus on science, And so when he would get into, he would go off on his, tirades about socialism or women's vote or, his utopian societies or spiritualism, they would just like roll their eyes and just say, well, just focus on his science. They thought he was being gullible. They thought he was being silly. Because it is true, right, that with spiritualism, there were more than a few mediums out there, some of whom were no doubt sincere and really believe they have this ability to connect with the dead, and then of course more than a few that were making good money on people's belief in that and purporting to connect them with departed loved ones and that sort of thing. And some of these were exposed, and they were in some cases even prosecuted. And so Darwin and his circle would just kind of look at Wallace and say, how can he believe this stuff, And Wallace, again, it's part of his just this radical, personality of his. He would just dig his heels in deeper. He'd just say, sure, there are some bad apples, but the couple of bad apples doesn't mean that they're all bad, and they're just giving the whole thing a bad name. But his friends would say he's so gullible. Like, can he see, that these people are just pulling the wool over his eyes, So that's kind of the way that went. This in itself, I wouldn't say strained their relationship. They were probably exasperated. It may be fairer to say that if anything was to strain their friendship, Darwin's and Wallace's, it might have been Wallace's application of this thinking to publicly then changing his mind, seemingly, on the idea that natural selection was responsible for the evolution of human cognition, the human brain. And this was a big deal for Darwin, because this is huge, right? The triumph of getting acceptance of evolution by natural selection, including then understanding humans as part of the natural world. after millennia of seeing humans as special and separate, then to have the co-discoverer of this idea then seemingly do an about face was quite a shock to Darwin.
Well, this is really illustrated with Wallace's work over the years about the mind. At one point, he makes this really brilliant argument that in evolution, the mind eventually for humans took precedent, and sort of he would say ignored the rest of the body. Now it all became about the mind and evolving to become more powerful. But once he adopts and once he really gets into spiritualism, he changes his mind about that.
Yes, the way I put that is sort of changing his mind, right, on the nature of the mind and the possibility of the evolution of the mind. And you're right, Darwin and others were deeply impressed when, in 1864, Wallace had written a paper on this intriguing idea about on human evolution and diversification, and understanding humans as having primate origins and natural selection long acting on humans bodily, but also mentally, but to a point where, he speculated, the properties of mind became dominant and ascendant, and selection began to operate mainly on properties of the mind. And so, yeah, the body was almost in a freeze frame, kind of left in a sort of a state of semi departure or divergence from our primate ancestors. But the part of us that really begins to take off at that point is the brain, is the mind. And there are other aspects to our biology, presumably, that went hand in hand with that.
Like the
and
hands.
That might have been I'm sorry?
Like the hands.
Like the hand, yes,
Yeah.
hand in hand, exactly. The manual dexterity, but and also maybe speech, the capacity for language and articulation, and all of these things may be of a piece, So on the one hand, Darwin is incredibly impressed by this. In fact, Darwin incorporated that model into his second most famous book, The Descent of Man, in 1871. So then all the more shocking when a few years later, just 5 years later, the end of the 1860s, Wallace lets Darwin know, well, I've come to a different view maybe of, the development of the mind, and I think you're going to be disappointed. And that's an understatement, right? So Darwin is just, again, he's just taken aback. And famously, he writes to Wallace, he says, "I hope you've not murdered too completely your own and my child." And he's just really very upset with Wallace over this. But Wallace,
he would see the mind then as being more akin to the spirit.
Yes, and the idea that, and maybe we shouldn't see this as a complete change of mind for Wallace, because he probably had been thinking along these lines, just not putting it all together. Wallace was long interested in properties of the mind, and really they are remarkable, and they really do have their mysteries. And one example of that would be the advent of the phenomenon that they called mesmerism, and maybe akin to what we call hypnotism today, but power of suggestion, these properties of mind. What accounts for that? Like, what is the mind anyway? You can imagine just how deeply puzzling this would be. And the idea that mind could exist separate from body is not, that's not so far-fetched at this time. And so when Wallace begins to connect this with his spiritualism, what is the spirit realm, perhaps, other than, and what is what people have been calling soul? What maybe is that but mind that is existing separate from the body? And so he begins to sort of wonder about this. And there's another important ingredient, too, that's worth taking into account here, and that is the idea of social improvement, the improvement of the human condition. And this is something that Wallace really deeply believed in. And in a kind of strict Darwinian Wallacean logic, even then they could observe that when it comes to humans anyway, it's certainly not true that the brightest, most talented, most able individuals are doing most of the reproducing. We have plenty of reproduction going on from those that are, maybe of lesser, abilities and lesser moral standing and those sorts of things. And so, how is it that society can be seen to have been improving all this time? Like, they really did believe in progress, and that society, if you kind of harken back to medieval days, and then you come up to 19th century Britain and its socio-political system and its economic system, and all of these things can be seen as great improvements. And this is just focusing on that country, true in many countries. And so he would ask, well, what could account for improvement when it's not clearly simply a kind of natural selection process? Well, maybe, he connects this with spiritualism. Maybe we are being helped along by some other greater intelligence, helping us eventually become, the best we can possibly be. And it kind of speaks to, I think, a kind of utopianism that we find in Wallace's thought, and it doesn't just come about the 1860s. You find, Wallace yearning about social improvement early on. When he's in Amazonia, in his narrative of his travels on the Amazon, there are passages in there where he sort of, dreaming about, living like an Indian in sort of this idyllic kind of natural state, kind of like a getting back to nature and shedding ourselves of all of these horrible complexities of civilization and living more simply. And he has these kind of utopian ideas sometimes that come out. You even see it in that 1864 paper where he talked about the evolution of mind. So the same paper that impressed Darwin so much, the last paragraph of that paper is really astonishing. It's where Wallace then invokes natural selection to speculate that this could, with the evolution of mind, this could eventually lead to a utopia on Earth, a paradise, and that this could be a social state that we could achieve through the ever improved evolution of mind, where we are nothing but beneficent and benevolent to each other. We have no need for any restrictive laws. Everyone acts according to what's best for everyone else. And it's just really amazing to think that this comes at the end of really an amazing scientific paper in 1864, and it speaks to Wallace's yearning for this social improvement. And it's not a coincidence that as he becomes interested in spiritualism, he sees that as a mechanism to realize this improvement, just as he later saw sexual selection, as we mentioned earlier, and women's free choice in marriage as yet another potential mechanism to lead to social improvement. That's a running theme throughout his long life.
James Costais has been our guest. He has joined us to talk about the life and times of Alfred Russel Wallace. He is the author of the book, Radical by Nature, The Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace. James Costais, I've enjoyed that very much, and I thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure and a privilege.